September 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter stood in the mess hall line, metal tray in hand, watching American cooks serve the evening meal. After 18 months as a prisoner of war, first in North Africa following his capture at Tunisia, then transported across the Atlantic to the United States, Richter still experienced disbelief at mealtimes. The cooks ladled portions onto his tray: roast beef, real beef, a portion larger than his fist, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, fresh bread, 2 slices, white bread that would have been a luxury in Germany even before the war, an apple for dessert, a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from roasted grain that Germans had been drinking since 1942. Richter carried his tray to a table where other prisoners from his barracks were already eating. Hans Zimmermann, captured in Italy, shook his head as he always did at meals. "This is more than I ate in a week at home before I was drafted," Zimmermann said. "My family would not believe this if I told them." But Richter knew Zimmermann had told them. They all had, in carefully censored letters sent home through the Red Cross. The responses from Germany, when they came at all, described hunger, rationing and privation that made the prisoners feel guilty for eating well while their families starved. The story of how German prisoners of war in American camps ate better than German civilians at home reveals the stark contrast between American abundance and German deprivation during World War II. It demonstrates the effectiveness of the Geneva Convention in protecting POWs held by nations that honored it. It shows how American agricultural and industrial capacity produced surpluses even during total war, while Germany's economy, devastated by Allied bombing and stretched across multiple fronts, collapsed into severe shortage. And it creates the paradox that German soldiers, having been captured and theoretically defeated, lived more comfortably than their families who remained free but starving in the Reich. This disparity had profound psychological effects on prisoners who struggled with guilt over their relative comfort, and it influenced post-war German attitudes toward America when former POWs returned home with stories of generous treatment that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American brutality. To understand the food situation for German POWs in America, one must first comprehend the Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war established international standards that signatories agreed to follow. Article 11 specified that POW rations should be equal in quantity and quality to depot troops of the detaining power. This meant that German prisoners of war in America were entitled to the same food that American soldiers in rear area positions received. The United States took this obligation seriously, both from humanitarian motives and from practical recognition that German treatment of American POWs might be influenced by how America treated German prisoners. American rear echelon soldiers in 1944 ate approximately 4,000 calories per day. Their rations included meat, dairy products, fresh vegetables, bread, coffee, and desserts. German POWs in American camps received similar rations adjusted slightly downward to approximately 3,500 calories per day, still far above the minimum required for adult males performing moderate labor. For comparison, German civilians by 1944 were rationed to approximately 1,500 calories per day in cities, with rural populations having slightly better access to food through local agriculture. The difference was stark. A German prisoner of war in Kansas ate more than twice as much as his wife in Hamburg. The contrast became even sharper when examining specific foods. German prisoners of war in America regularly received fresh meat, often beef or pork, served several times per week. German civilians at home were rationed to perhaps 250 grams of meat per week, and by late 1944 often received none at all as livestock herds were depleted and transportation systems collapsed under Allied bombing. POWs received fresh milk and butter. German civilians had not seen fresh milk in years, relying on reconstituted powder when available. POWs ate white bread made from wheat flour. German civilians ate dark bread made from rye mixed with sawdust, potato flour and other extenders that reduced nutritional value while increasing bulk. The quality and variety of food available to prisoners of war reflected American agricultural abundance. The United States in 1944 was producing record harvests of wheat, corn and soybeans. American farms, mechanized and efficient, supplied not only American military forces and civilians, but also allied nations through Lend-Lease programs. Even with these obligations, surplus remained sufficient to feed 400,000 Axis POWs held in American camps according to Geneva Convention standards. Germany, conversely, was starving. Allied bombing had destroyed transportation infrastructure, making it difficult to move food from farms to cities. The loss of Ukraine and other occupied territories eliminated sources of grain that Germany had exploited early in the war. German agriculture, deprived of male labor, drafted into military service, and lacking fuel for mechanized equipment, produced declining yields. The food situation in Germany by late 1944 was approaching catastrophic levels that would worsen through the war's final months and into the immediate post-war period. Klaus Richter's experience was typical of German POWs in America. After his capture in Tunisia in May 1943, he spent several months in camps in North Africa where conditions were harsh, food was limited, and survival was uncertain. The British and American forces in North Africa faced their own supply challenges, and captured Axis soldiers received minimal rations. But in autumn 1943, Richter was transported to the United States along with thousands of other German POWs. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks, and prisoners were fed regularly during the journey, receiving better food than they had eaten in months. Upon arrival in America, Richter was processed through Fort Meade, Maryland, where he received medical screening, delousing, new clothing, and orientation about camp rules. He was then transported by train to Camp Concordia in Kansas, one of hundreds of POW camps established across the United States to house captured enemy soldiers far from coastal areas where escape might be feasible. The journey across America shocked many German prisoners. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was a weak, decadent nation devastated by the Depression and incapable of industrial production. What they saw from train windows contradicted this propaganda completely. American cities were intact, undamaged by bombing. Farms were productive and mechanized. Civilians appeared well-fed and prosperous. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality began eroding prisoners' beliefs about the war and Germany's inevitable victory. Camp Concordia housed approximately 4,000 German POWs in a compound of barracks, administrative buildings, a mess hall, recreation areas, and workshops. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by American soldiers, but security was relatively relaxed. Escape attempts were rare because prisoners quickly realized that escaping from the center of Kansas meant walking hundreds of miles through flat, open terrain where a German accent would immediately identify them as escapees. More pragmatically, most prisoners had no desire to escape from comfortable captivity back to a losing war. They were safe, well-fed, and alive. Why risk that for an uncertain return to combat? The daily routine at Camp Concordia centered around meals, work, and recreation. Breakfast was served at 0700 hours and typically included oatmeal or other hot cereal, eggs when available, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Lunch at noon was the main meal, featuring meat, potatoes, or another starch, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dinner at 1800 hours was lighter, but still substantial, often including soup, sandwiches, fruit, and milk. Prisoners who worked on labor details outside the camp received additional rations to compensate for increased caloric needs. The food was prepared in large institutional kitchens by American cooks supervised by camp staff, though some prisoners worked in the kitchens and could observe food preparation. The quality of the food impressed prisoners who had experienced years of declining rations in the Wehrmacht. German military rations by 1943 had deteriorated significantly from the early war period. Frontline troops still received priority for available food, but quality and quantity had declined. Rear echelon German troops often subsisted on bread, potatoes, and occasional sausage made from dubious ingredients. Fresh meat was rare. Vegetables were scarce. Butter had been replaced by margarine years earlier. The rations German POWs received in American camps exceeded what many had eaten as soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and certainly exceeded what they would have received as civilians in Germany. Hans Zimmermann, Richter's friend from the mess hall, had been captured in Italy in 1944 during the Allied advance toward Rome. His family lived in Cologne, an industrial city that had been heavily bombed by the RAF and USAAF. Letters from his wife described conditions that worsened monthly. By autumn 1944, she wrote that rations had been cut again, that fresh food was unavailable at any price, that she was trading family possessions for food on the black market. She described neighbors dying from malnutrition-related illnesses. She asked whether Zimmermann, as a POW, had enough to eat and whether conditions were tolerable. Zimmermann struggled with how to respond. He could not honestly describe his situation without creating painful contrast with her suffering. He settled for vague reassurances that he was adequately fed and treated according to international law, hoping she would read between the lines without feeling abandoned. The psychological impact of eating well while families starved created genuine distress for many POWs. Some prisoners ate sparingly, saving portions or refusing seconds from guilt over their relative privilege. Others ate heartily, reasoning that refusing food would not help their families and that maintaining their health was important for eventual return home. Camp commanders and guards noticed the guilt and attempted to address it through camp newsletters and informal discussions. Prisoners were reminded that they had not chosen their circumstances, that their families would want them to stay healthy, and that the disparity in food reflected Germany's military defeats rather than any moral failing by the prisoners. The work programs established at POW camps complicated prisoners' feelings about their situation. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, though not at tasks directly supporting the captor nation's war effort. Officers could not be compelled to work, but could volunteer. Most German POWs in America worked partly from boredom, partly to earn small wages that allowed them to purchase personal items, and partly because work provided purpose and routine. Common work assignments included agricultural labor, logging, food processing, and construction. Prisoners harvested crops, processed sugar beets, cut timber, and built roads. They were paid nominal wages, typically 80 cents per day, which could be spent at camp canteens on toiletries, tobacco, snacks, and other non-essential items. The irony that German POWs were harvesting American crops that would feed American soldiers fighting against Germany was not lost on the prisoners. Some refused to work on ideological grounds, but most pragmatically accepted that the war was effectively over for them and that their labor benefited them through better conditions and small wages. Farmers and businesses that employed POW labor generally reported that German prisoners were hard-working, skilled, and reliable. This positive interaction between German prisoners of war and American civilians helped erode stereotypes on both sides and created personal relationships that influenced post-war attitudes. The food disparity between POWs in America and civilians in Germany became more extreme as the war entered its final phase. By winter 1944 to 45, Germany faced collapse of its food distribution system. Allied bombing had destroyed railroads, roads and bridges, needed to move food from agricultural areas to cities. German-controlled territory was shrinking as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Western allies advanced from the west. Agricultural regions that had supplied German cities were being liberated or destroyed in fighting. The Nazi government maintained rationing systems and attempted to ensure equitable distribution, but the systems were failing. Urban populations faced genuine starvation. Rural populations with access to local farms survived better, but still faced severe shortages of items like cooking oil, sugar, coffee, and meat. German prisoners of war in America, meanwhile, continued eating regular, substantial meals. By early 1945, as news reached prisoners about conditions in Germany, the psychological burden became heavier. Letters from home, when they arrived at all after disruption of mail service, described desperate situations. Families wrote of eating tulip bulbs, catching rats for meat, and boiling leather shoes for soup. Children were starving. Elderly family members were dying from cold and malnutrition. The contrast with 3 hot meals per day in a warm barracks was unbearable for some prisoners. Camp counselors and chaplains provided support, but guilt and helplessness were common emotional responses. The treatment of German POWs in America contrasted sharply with treatment of Allied POWs held by Germany. While Germans in America ate well and lived in relative comfort, American and British POWs in Germany faced hunger, brutal treatment, and in some cases, death from neglect. Soviet POWs held by Germany faced even worse conditions, with millions dying from starvation, disease, and execution. The Nazi regime considered Slavic peoples racially inferior and treated Soviet prisoners with deliberate cruelty, providing starvation rations and forcing them to labor until death. The difference reflected the fundamental distinction between democratic nations that honored international law and totalitarian regimes that viewed such laws as constraints to be ignored when convenient. American treatment of German POWs served strategic purposes beyond humanitarian obligation. The US government recognized that generous treatment would encourage German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Propaganda leaflets dropped over German lines promised good treatment for those who surrendered, and stories from POWs who had surrendered and found themselves well treated reinforced these messages. The policy succeeded in encouraging surrenders, particularly in the war's final months when German soldiers recognized defeat was inevitable and preferred American captivity to death in futile combat or Soviet captivity, which was known to be harsh. The experience of German POWs in America also served post-war diplomatic purposes. When prisoners returned to Germany after the war, they brought stories of American generosity, abundance, and fair treatment. These stories contradicted Nazi propaganda and contributed to pro-American attitudes in post-war Germany. Former prisoners of war became advocates for democracy and reconciliation with the West, influencing Germany's post-war political development. The investment America made in treating POWs well during the war paid dividends in creating a stable democratic West Germany during the Cold War. The food situation for German civilians worsened dramatically after Germany's surrender in May 1945. The immediate post-war period, often called the Hunger Winter of 1945 to 46, saw near-famine conditions in many German cities. Allied occupation authorities struggled to feed populations in zones they controlled while also maintaining sufficient supplies for their own forces and dealing with millions of displaced persons. German POWs held in America after the war's end continued to eat better than German civilians for months or even years until repatriation was completed. Some prisoners of war volunteered to remain in America longer rather than return immediately to devastated Germany, where food was scarce and employment uncertain. The repatriation of German POWs from America began in 1946 and continued into 1947 as shipping became available and as occupation authorities in Germany determined they could handle returning prisoners. Klaus Richter was repatriated in spring 1946, returning to Germany after nearly 3 years in American captivity. He carried with him memories of abundance, fair treatment, and a dramatically different perspective on America than the propaganda he had believed before capture. When he reached his family home in Bavaria, he found his parents gaunt from hunger, his siblings stunted from malnutrition during critical growth years, and his community devastated by war damage and food shortages. The contrast with Camp Concordia was shocking. Richter had been eating 3,500 calories per day, while his family survived on less than half that. The guilt he had felt in camp intensified, but his family expressed only relief that he had survived and that he had been treated well. The phenomenon of POWs eating better than civilians at home was not unique to German prisoners in America. It occurred whenever democratic nations holding prisoners honored Geneva Convention standards, while prisoner home nations faced wartime deprivation. But the German-American case was particularly stark because of the extreme disparity between American abundance and German shortage, and because the large numbers of German POWs held in America made the situation widely known among German families. The experience shaped an entire generation of Germans who learned that America, despite being portrayed by Nazi propaganda as weak and decadent, was actually powerful, prosperous, and fair. This lesson influenced West Germany's post-war alignment with the Western Alliance and contributed to the strong German-American relationship that developed during the Cold War. The story of German POWs eating better in US camps than German civilians did at home reveals uncomfortable truths about war, captivity, and the arbitrary nature of suffering during conflict. Soldiers captured by generous enemies sometimes fared better than civilians, remaining free in defeated nations. The protection offered by international law and honored by democratic nations proved more valuable than freedom in a collapsed totalitarian state. The POWs experienced this paradox personally, living comfortable, well-fed lives while their families starved, creating psychological burdens that many carried for the rest of their lives. But the story also demonstrates that humane treatment of enemies serves long-term strategic interests, that generosity during war can build friendships during peace, and that the choices nations make about how to treat prisoners reflect their fundamental values and shape their legacies for generations to come.